Those two.
Right, up and running. Thank you. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Dorset Council's Audit and Governance Committee. My name is Councillor Matt Hall, and I'm the chairman of this committee. Welcome, everybody. Officers and members, please, because we are live streaming, the first time you speak, can you introduce yourselves? Welcome to our two new committee members as well. Nice to see you. Welcome on board. As we've often said in this committee, there is no such thing as a silly question. Please feel free to ask at any time. Members, please remember to turn your microphones off after you have spoken. So we'll make a start. Agenda item number 1, apologies for absence, please.
Apologies, no formal apologies received, although we are still expecting cases and
Thank you. Councillor Rod Adkins actually sent me an email last night. He's had a bit of an emergency, so he won't be joining us this morning. Agenda item number 2 is minutes from the last meeting. Are there any points that any member wishes to make? Councillor Christopher.
Can I just say, Councillor Simon Christopher, Marshwood Vale, and what a pleasure it is to return to this committee. Chair, could you please inquire in respect of the officer relevant, item 53, in response to a comment, risk 378, what the result of those deliberations were? Just to take you back to the previous meeting, failure to inspire a future generation of political leaders was not within the gift of the council. The service manager for assurance agreed to take the comment back to the senior leadership team. Chair, would you inquire what the result of those deliberations were between the service manager and the senior leadership team for the benefit of us all? Thank you.
I certainly will do. Mark Eyre.
Morning, everyone. I'm Mark Eyre. I'm the service manager for assurance. That discussion hasn't yet happened, so that will happen in advance of the next report into this committee when we'll be reviewing the risks with the corporate services management team.
Can you please make sure that we're all aware of everything that happens? I believe, Aidan, as our 151 officer, you have a couple of comments to make with regards to some of the items in the aforementioned minutes.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone. Aidan Dunn, Executive Director for Corporate Development and Chief Finance Officer. In that section of the minutes where we were discussing risk, just 3 paragraphs down, it says that the chairman raised points on a series of risks and asked me as Corporate Executive Director for Corporate Development to decide or to comment on whether they should be on the forward plan. So in terms of a quick summary, there were 4 themes of those risks. Firstly, there was ICT and cybersecurity. Secondly, value for money. Thirdly, information governance. And fourthly, procurement. In my view and in discussion with colleagues, I'm satisfied that ICT and cybersecurity have been covered through various briefings that this committee has had, but most recently by a review that the LGA did, a Cyber 360 review. And secondly, procurement. The procurement risk, I believe, is covered as well through a combination of the audit report and the emphasis we have on procurement as part of our commercial transformation programme. But I do think it would be worthwhile bringing back to the committee or putting on the forward plan, first of all, an update on the work on value for money. And that was an issue that was raised at Cabinet yesterday, so it's certainly of interest. And secondly, on information compliance and governance. Once again, I think that should be on the forward plan as well. So when we get to the forward plan agenda item later on this morning, it would be grateful if we could schedule both of those items.
Thank you, Aidan. And if I could just do a further follow-up as well. I mentioned at the last meeting to yourself and to Jonathan the issue with regards to the high-level risks which go to the senior leadership team. and for want of a better word, they then seem to somewhat disappear. Is there any sort of news, shall we say, on a process to make this committee aware of what happens with those risks?
In terms of, so the senior leadership team receives the risk report, summary risk report that you receive here, and that determines our priorities and the way we work. Is there anything, could you just elaborate a little bit more specific that you're looking for from the senior leadership team in that regard?
I can't remember the specifics offhand, but there were a number of items mentioned in the last risk report, which, for want of a better word, said passed to the senior leadership team for deliberation. And it's that process that then something goes to the senior leadership team, but nobody from the senior leadership team, as it were, comes back to this committee and says, risk X, Y, Z, we are dealing it by A, B, C sort of thing. I believe, Mark, you want to come back on that one?
Thanks, Chair. I think probably the key thing is within that risk report and within those risks that are escalated through to the senior leadership team, there is always that ongoing management update. So if there's any particular key points that have come out from that discussion, that would be reflected back by the risk owner within that text.
Thank you, Mark. Any other questions from members? If not, can I have a proposer for the minutes, please? Councillor Cocking and a seconder. Thank you. All those in favour? That's passed. Right. Next agenda item is declarations of interest. Do we have any from members? No. Agenda item 4, public participation. One day we'll get a member of the public. Agenda item 5, the main crux of today's meeting. We'll start with, as I say, agenda item number 5, which is the report from our internal auditors, SWAP. Over to you, Sally. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Sally White, Assistant Director, SWAP Internal Audit Services. This is our first update report for the 22-23 financial year, and the highlights of the report are that we are offering a reasonable interim opinion. We haven't identified any significant corporate risks as part of our work. We've issued 3 limited assurance opinion reports since our last update report, which was January, as we delivered our annual opinion report in April. And at the time of writing this report, we highlighted a number of long outstanding actions. So if we start with the long outstanding actions, we've provided a graph on page 3, which is page 16 of your agenda pack, which shows an aged profile of the overdue actions. As you will see, at the time we wrote this report, there were a number of actions that were older than 12 months overdue. This report went to the senior leadership team a few weeks ago, and there was a strong commitment to progress the long overdue actions. When we wrote the report, there were 34 priority 1 and 2 recommendations that were overdue. This has now reduced to 25, and we are anticipating that this will reduce further over the forthcoming week. So there has been a significant improvement in the outstanding actions, which is extremely positive. I should point out that our action tracker does allow for officers to move the implementation date of actions if there are delays for any reason. However, our metrics do measure from the original agreed date rather than any revised dates. We feel that this provides an accurate picture of exactly how long actions have been outstanding. In addition, we do urge colleagues not to be overly optimistic in setting their own deadlines for implementing actions, and we encourage setting reasonable and achievable timescales, even if these are slightly longer. We do now have a much more effective follow-up process, which sits within the directorates themselves, and we believe this to be proving effective. When we started the action tracker, there were 69 overdue actions. We are now at 25, which I believe demonstrates a significant improvement, and officers do work hard to ensure that agreed actions are implemented. We believe our Agile audit process makes officers a collaborative part of our work and feel that we have a greater ownership of the actions that they agree. We're very hopeful that the performance figures will improve further when we report again to the committee in September. If we now move to the 3 limited assurance pieces of work, the first of these being the service user financial contributions. The Executive Director for Adults has provided an update of the key work being undertaken around this area in preparation for the implementation of the care cap, which is likely to impact on the number of adult service users making contributions for their care. We are aware that actions are currently in progress. Moving on to debt recovery, there are some key findings in this review, but we are aware again that finance colleagues are actively working on the actions. For context, during the pandemic, a light touch approach to debt recovery and the government's breathing space regulations will have undoubtedly resulted in greater accumulation of debt, as it will for many other councils. The service did ask us to undertake the review and acknowledge the position at that time. Because of the number and nature of the findings and actions, we have agreed to undertake a more formal follow-up review in early July. This will enable us to provide a more detailed update to the September Audit Committee. The final limited report is the Residential Children's Home Report. Again, we were asked to undertake the review, so there was an acknowledgement that financial controls required some improvement, and we are aware that actions are actively being worked on. I think we've had an update this morning where we've been told that the actions are complete, but we've yet to see the evidence to support this, which will enable us to sign off those priority 2 actions. That's the highlights from me. Happy for any questions.
Thank you, Sally. First of all, if I could open this up to Aidan to make any responses that he wishes to make about the contents of this, particularly with regards to the debt figures which are mentioned.
Thank you. If I could make sort of a couple of general points to start, and it's an issue we've touched on this committee for the last couple of meetings about the number of outstanding actions for the officers to take. And I'm heartened by the progress that we're seeing, as Sally has described. We're still not perfect. We've still got quite some way to go, but certainly the right direction of travel there, which is really encouraging. I think to move on to the debt aspect, this first of all, as Sally has mentioned, debt was an area of increasing concern for us, certainly as a financial team. So we asked the internal audit team, we asked them specifically to look into this area for us to shine a spotlight on it, which has proven to be very helpful. Part of what we're trying to do is improve our transparency, and you may have seen in the Cabinet paper yesterday, we reported in much more detail than ever before about the level of debt, in particular around council tax arrears as well. So as an organisation, debtors range from council tax, business rates, through to the trade debt, as Sally's just described, as well as, and in particular, around adult social care charging, which is a growth area, as Sally has alluded to. It is a complex picture. I mean, for example, in adult social care, some of the debt is it's secured against residents' properties. There's a legal framework around that. So whilst there's a debt, there's a degree of security around it. Versus at the other extreme, for example, for council tax, we've certainly been progressing and reducing the outstanding balances on our council tax. We have to be mindful of legislation that and the guidance saying sort of take it, be more proportionate. So it's a sensitive balance, in particular, given where we are around the cost of living as well. So we continue to pursue our debt. We continue to ensure that those that do owe us money, that we've got an agreement of how they do repay, but we're mindful of the pressures that our residents are under as well. We're trying to strike that right balance. And as I say, I think Sally's report is helpful in giving us some areas that we need to tighten up on, and we are tightening up on, but we've just got to make sure that we as I say, keep that right balance.
Thank you, Aidan. Questions, members? Councillor Legg.
Thank you, Chair.
Robin Legg from Sherborne Rural. Can I start on page 3 of your report? And I have to say, being a bit of an old fuddy-duddy, the reference to place, where you've got outstanding actions, and you've got 12 outstanding actions, are all in place, and they've been outstanding for over 12 months. I don't quite understand what has been outstanding for 12 months. Can you actually give us a word or a phrase which will encapsulate what exactly that issue is, what we're talking about? Oh, yeah.
Thank you. No, that's a good question, and it actually refers to a number of audits that have taken place within the Place Directorate. The good news is that whilst the figure was 12 at the time we wrote the report, that has now reduced to 3. We have 1 outstanding action on a Homes Dorset audit and 2 outstanding actions on a coroner's audit that we undertook. So that's the current position as at today. Does that answer your question?
It's helpful, Chairman, because it gives a little bit of understanding to what the generality of the word place means, because it could be a variety of things, as you said, including the coroner. I've got 2 more questions, really, in relation to pages 6 and 7. Oh, no. Yeah, 6 and 7. There's about £5.5 million worth of debt outstanding in relation to essentially social care. There was an item on, and I think it was on Radio 4 at lunchtime yesterday, which was an individual who had eventually gone to age concern. It was their daughter, I think, had gone to age concern because their mother was in a care home. And I don't think they said which local authority it was, but they had discovered that they had been overpaying for years and years and years. And in fact, Age Concern, when they investigated the matter, discovered that there had been an absolutely massive overpayment by this lady, topping up the cost of care for her mother. And I'm just wondering, when we talk, generally about £5.5 million worth of debt here, are we inadvertently overcharging some people? And maybe the level of debt is not as much as we think it should be.
I don't know, Aidan, if you want to come back on that one, or Jim?
Probably comment just very generally. If you wanted to know a bit more of the detail around the process that we follow and the regulations that we work in, can arrange for a colleague from within the financial assessments team to give you that briefing. We do work within regulations which there is quite often escalation of matters either to the Ombudsman, for example, regularly see those cases. So they are tested, we are open to them, same as all councils are. But if you wanted a further briefing document on how this works. So I suppose to answer your question directly, could we inadvertently be asking somebody for a higher contribution than they should pay? We could be. It would be inadvertent. I can't say that everything is absolutely 100% right all the time. Some of these things are subject to interpretation about how you do or don't disregard certain benefits that people get and what the Care Act requires of us to do. So application is consistent for us. And as I say, we are tested, we are open to scrutiny and open to audit as well.
Can I say in response to that, Chairman, I will endeavour to find on the BBC News app the item that was discussed yesterday on the radio. And if I can find it, I'll send it to you. Because it was quite shocking. And obviously Age Concern had picked it up as a significant national issue, because I think they felt that quite a number of local authorities were not doing the calculations in the correct manner. And the other one, which follows on from it, which is on the next page of your report, is about the level of debt that's accrued in relation to council tax payments. I've had several bits of council tax casework which have headed in my direction in the last 12 months. And I remember writing to the head of the department saying, you know, you wait for years and then nothing, and you get nothing in relation to council tax, and then you get 3 queries coming along like buses all at the same time. And it did strike me, particularly looking at the council tax regulations for council tax benefit, that they are incredibly complicated. I mean, they are something like 260 odd pages of regulations. And you've got, particularly where you've got instances of live-in carers and what their contribution should be and how it's calculated, is mind-blowingly indecipherable. I mean, you just can't, it's very, very difficult to get to the bottom of it and to get a kind of answer which is straightforward and understandable. So it wouldn't be terribly surprising if some mistakes were being made there too.
Thank you for that. I want just for a moment put into context the revenues, the work the revenues and benefits team are doing at the moment. So first of all, I quite agree it's a hugely complex space, and we're very fortunate to have a very skilled team. That skilled team have been, I think, in addition to the day job, over the last 18 months, 2 years, it's that team that's also been doing the £200 million worth of business grants, going out to support the business grants. And then most recently, they've been paying out to our residents, 121,000 residents, the energy rebate as well. So that's on top of the day job. And then in addition to that, we've started the work to integrate Stour Valley and Pool Partnership, as Sally's alluded to in her report. So first of all, I just wanted to sort of pay tribute to that team who have worked incredibly hard under really difficult circumstances and continue to do so. But notwithstanding, I think the complexity of the legislation means that we need that specialist team. And coming with your casework, as you say, I trust and I hope that you're getting a good response from the team and that they're being helpful and supportive. And if not, then please do sort of have a little bit of patience given what's going on. But also, if you're not getting the responses you want, then feel free to escalate. But as Jim's just described, though, it's really, really difficult, and perhaps we don't always get it right first time, and there's that element of judgment as well. But thank you. Thanks.
Councillor Cocking, I believe you had a question.
Thank you, Chair. My question is on page 4. Oops, sorry, just need to get my notes. Page 4 of the report and page 17 of the agenda. It's about benchmarking. We've talked quite a bit about benchmarking in our last few committee meetings over the years. And it says that there was a comparison strategy. And my question is, how did we compare to other local authorities that did respond? It says in the report that not all local authorities responded to the comparison questions or how the report was sent out. But I just wanted to know, how did we compare to other local authorities on the three informal comparisons and the one formal comparison? Because parts of the work that they looked at was the ones that have been highlighted in this meeting. You know, and how was the feedback given to those services? Was it verbally and on a report? But I have got a follow-up question as well, but I didn't know if they wanted that. Sally wanted that first of all. So I just wanted to know, how do we do in compared to other councils?
I'm happy to deal with that one for you, Councillor Cocking. Just for clarification, we use the term benchmarking to describe any kind of sort of service comparison. So it might not necessarily be financial or sort of value for money. It could just be how services are operating. You know, of course, we can actually provide councillors with that feedback. We do need a certain level of response to be able to provide a formal report to the service. And if we don't get that level of response, it's very hard, but we would always feed back to the service, probably in the form of an email, a conversation followed up by an email, so that they have that information. Is that helpful?
Got to introduce myself as well. Councillor Susan Cocking, representing Portland. Yes, Sally, that's lovely, thank you. Yeah, I think it would be useful, I would find it useful to have a report of summary on the feedback, just so that we could see where we are. And I know benchmarking is not just financial, there's lots of other issues around benchmarking. So I think it would be really useful for the committee to have some sort of report or summary of what was conducted and what the results were.
That's fine. I can provide that for you. Aidan may wish to say something about the piece of work that we did on the strategy that we looked at, the reserve strategy. Sorry.
Thanks, Sally. Yeah, it's a helpful opportunity for a quick example. So whilst benchmarking in this context isn't necessarily scoring value for money, a particular piece of work that SWAP did for us was around reserves. So SWAP wrote round to, I think it was about sort of 15 or 16 other local authorities on our request, saying, how do you report your reserves to the to Cabinet, to full council? How do you track changes in reserves? And we got a really rich picture back of how different authorities do it in different ways. It's all part of our growth and development. And on the back of that, in the report that went to Cabinet yesterday, the finance report, we reported on our reserves in a slightly new format, which we felt was helpful. So a really helpful piece of learning, but it wasn't necessarily a traditional benchmarking, as in represent 3% value for money. But once again, really interesting learning, other authorities, which I'm more than happy to share with you.
Any other questions from members? Councillor Biggs.
Yes, Richard Biggs, Dorchester Poundbury Ward. My question is around residential children's homes. And as all councillors and I guess staff really are corporate parents to our most vulnerable children, looked after children. This is one I think may seem relatively trivial when some of the issues, because part of this is around pocket money basically, setting of allowances. But there is no sort of agreed amount nationally, and it varies a lot. So I think it's important, and I'm glad to see that is going to be sort of standardised or looked into, and better controls amongst the other issues that were identified. But we are only talking about our own children homes. Most of our children are in private providers, and if you saw the recent report by the Children's Commissioner, was scathing on the profit-taking and the irregularities, including levels of pocket money and things like that. It's an easy thing to reduce it and to spend it on the home to make it, so you don't have to spend from the profits, etc. So I would like to know whether there's any consideration of actually looking at our private providers as well, as many of our councillors will have them in your wards, probably totally unaware that they're even there because they're popping up increasingly. Nothing necessarily wrong with that, and they're all regulated by Ofsted, etc. But I always feel a bit concerned that we never give that level of scrutiny to our private sector providers. It's done internally at officers' level, I understand that. Thank you.
Aidan, I don't know if you want to come back on that?
Thank you. Yes, it's a very helpful challenge. As Councillor Biggs said, the report itself was very sort of bespoke about our in-house service. But I'll talk to colleagues in children's services about sort of the current arrangements for privately provided homes, and it might well be an area that Audit could investigate. So if I could talk to children's colleagues and come back to you on that point. Thank you.
Councillor Christopher.
Thank you, Chair. These are two very diverse questions. With respect to the internal audit report on page 7, the last full complete paragraph and also the last line, clearly there is almost a perfect storm of having to be told that you have to take a light touch, and also there is commentary on the merger of systems within there. Can we have assurance that we are now moving back to an appropriate level of debt collection where court action is being taken, and indeed where appropriate attachment to earnings on a decided court case is actually following from that. I say all of that because I did make mention at the start of this to the last paragraph and also the last line. The last line of page 7 does talk about write-offs, and if there's anything that really should concern anybody on this committee, that is the writing off of debts when good, responsible people are actually paying their liabilities to the council. I'm sorry if that's quite a long question, but that now takes me to my second question. And as you know, I have a very good working relationship with parish councils in my ward, and this is a question following on from my meeting with Chiddick parish councillors yesterday, who inquired as to the arrangements between Dorset Police and Dorset Council for the use of parking spaces in the car parks in Bridport. Now, this is a highly relevant issue because, of course, Bridport is a tremendously popular place, and where, for instance, if we're not receiving any money from Dorset Police, then money is obviously lost to Dorset Council. I must confess that I did have the benefit yesterday of having the Dorset Police and Crime Commissioner with me at that meeting. We asked the Police and Crime Commissioner, and he, like me, we're not the font of all knowledge, so we would like to inquire what the relationship is and clarification that Dorset Police do indeed pay for those places in the very busy town of Dorset, Bridport. Thank you very much. Can I have answers to those questions from the officer, please?
Thank you. I can certainly answer the first part. I can't answer the second part, I'm afraid. The first part, can I give you assurance around returning to normal levels of debt? I'll give you some context around that question. I think it might take some time to return to normal levels of debt. The concern that we had, I think, when we asked SWAP to get involved in some of this process is this isn't just debt that arises from a single source. There are a number of different factors in play, as Aidan had mentioned earlier, right from sundry trade debt, where the process is much simpler and more straightforward, all the way through to service user contributions, which are governed by requirements of the Care Act, a whole different level of sensitivity and process around that. What I can give you assurance of is that we are returning to the method and processes and tighter timelines and better grip around our own processes for making sure that things are taken through the process as quickly as possible. The final sanction, of course, is the courts. Court time has been limited over the last 2 years. It is slowly returning, but there is a backlog, obviously. So we are in a queuing system. So we will speed up our own method and our process and our system. And you'll appreciate yourself, obviously, Councillor Christopher, the sooner you go after these things, timing is everything, isn't it? You've got much better chance of pay. But there is indication, certainly we look monthly with the portfolio holder about collection rates for council tax and business rates specifically, and those rates, whilst they're not quite at pre-pandemic levels, they are improving and getting better every month.
Thank the officer for his response. I'm very pleased that processes have returned to normal, and I take it as read that there are clearly concerns about continuing delays with the courts. I spent yesterday afternoon with 90 business people, and they are also exasperated by the delays experienced in the court in relation to debt collection. Thank you.
I think with regards to the second point, unless Aidan will become the fountain of all knowledge very quickly, can I leave that with yourself and Jonathan as part of the senior leadership team to find out the answer to that and come back? Yes, Councillor Christopher.
Yes, just to put the officer on the spot, Chiddick Parish Council has a meeting on Tuesday, and I'd welcome a response by 10 o'clock on Tuesday morning. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you. Councillor Pipe.
Thank you, Chairman. Councillor Bill Pipe, the Litchits and Upton. I've 3 points I'd like to make. Firstly, Sally, you said that you report that you have not identified any significant audit risks. What risks have you identified that are less than significant?
that is quite a difficult question. I mean,
I ask it every time.
I guess every other audit finding that we haven't identified as significant is less than significant. However, as you will see, we place importance on all of our audit recommendations, and we have a follow-up process, and we are encouraging officers currently to work on some long outstanding actions. So we do have a process of prioritising actions, which would indicate the significance of the action that we are recommending. Is that helpful?
Yes, it helps. Thank you. On a second point, Chairman, I'm very pleased to see a good reduction in long-term overdue actions, but as has already been mentioned, place of 12 long overdue actions and corporate 5. How significant are these delays in implementation, and what are the effects on the running of Dorset Council and its everyday business with these long overdue actions still being in place?
Yeah, thank you. If I could comment on that. And just to highlight to members of the committee and new members in particular, in Sally's report on the bottom of page 1 is highlighted this link in blue, just at the bottom of page 1 there. And if when members get a moment and if they wish to, if they follow that link through, it takes members through to a spreadsheet where all the detail of the action is, which you can explore at your leisure. But my role is to help guide you through there. The risks and the actions do vary, and I'll just sort of quickly comment on some of the corporate ones. For example, there's a long overdue action is around our equality, diversity and inclusion strategy. And so a series of actions were agreed, but subsequently the member of staff that was leading on that piece of work has left. We've got a new colleague that started who's got a slightly different approach and is working with Audit to make sure that we get the same outcome but with that different approach. So that delays somewhat, but we kind of feel as though we're addressing the point. And then other overdue actions, I think there's a degree of optimism that Sally has mentioned. So there's a series of overdue actions in relation to debt. They were due at the end of the 31st of May, and we haven't quite got there yet. We're sort of 3 weeks behind the schedule. We've got a session with Sally shortly to take Audit through to provide the evidence to sign off those actions. So it really does vary, but it goes back to that point that was raised at the beginning, that Sally comes to senior leadership team and individual directorate management teams as well. We have an audit representative there to make sure that we're really focused on the right actions. But as I say, if you get a moment to follow that link through, it just gives you a bit more flavour of what the sort of range of issues we're looking at.
Thank you, Chairman. And finally, as has already been spoken about by my colleague on the committee bench there, how much of the debt that's owed to Dorset Council is expected to be written off, and how much debt was sort of written off last year? Can anybody give me a clue on that one?
I don't have those numbers off the top of my head, but I can certainly find how much debt was written off. In the old days of the County Council, we used to include that in the quarterly reports, but we don't bring it in now. Part of the issue is we could have still brought that figure in, but since we've become a unitary authority, just reporting that figure on its own is only part of the picture. We would also need to look at council tax and business rates and other aspects of trading as well. So I can come back to you with what the actual numbers are. In terms of how much I expect to write off, I'm not in the business of projections like that. Any debt that is on our book is still fair game. We are still progressing it. But we have a number of recommendations in the SWOT report to go through process, which have reflected with Councillor Christopher's question. By the end of September, and certainly by the end of this year, we'll be in a position where I hope our debt has certainly improved as a result of not just us improving our process, but also courts returning to normal. So I won't guess, but I can give you some more contextual information as we start to progress this better.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for your answer. Notwithstanding the slowness of the courts and all the rest of the processes which we seem to be having a fight with at the moment to get results, I look forward to those figures in due course. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Aidan.
Any other questions from members? Councillor Christopher.
This is not so much a question, this is a commentary. Given the size of the expenditure by Dorset Council and the asset base, I'm somewhat underwhelmed by the level of internal audit activity.
Aidan.
Just to clarify, I'm underwhelmed by the level of reporting. There's clearly lots of concern about Dorset Council and inflation, our car parking charges, etc. And I would perhaps have expected a greater level of reporting. That's my own personal comment.
Aidan, I don't know if you want to comment on that with regards to the contract we have with Swap, etc.
Yeah, thank you. Good challenge. So the SWAP, our internal audit team, we are appointed through a contract. We agree an audit plan with SWAP based on our assessment of the number of days' work we anticipate during the course of a year. We do a risk-based assessment with that. Jonathan and I do that risk-based assessment and have assessed that given the early days of the bringing the council together, or the councils together, we felt it was high-risk profiles. We had more days then and have reduced it a little bit. So the internal audit team have a rolling plan that's agreed with the audit committee here about where it's going to be looked at. But I would emphasise or give a broader view from across the council that in addition to audit, we've also got a number of scrutiny committees, a number of overview committees, as well as cabinet as well. So there is a large degree of oversight of the activities of the council. In terms of Jonathan and myself, monitoring officer and Section 151 officers' assessment, it feels proportionate. But of course, if there are areas of risk that Councillor Christopher, or indeed any areas of that the rest of the audit committee would like us to look at or prioritise, then we could certainly build that into the rolling forward plan.
Jonathan, did you want to make any comments?
Chairman, if I can Jonathan Mayer, Director for Legal and Democratic. Good morning. Just to follow up what Aidan has just said, there is the opportunity for this committee, for Councillor Christopher, if he wishes to identify any particular area of emphasis where he would expect there to be some greater scrutiny, then absolutely we can do that. We've heard this morning, for instance, from Councillor Legg has identified a particular concern where he's going to forward some further details to officers about some concerns that he's identified through news coverage concerning other councils, and we can follow through those areas. But we have got a well-developed audit programme. We've got audit hours that Aidan and I believe are proportionate and appropriate for the size and complexity of this authority.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'll just remind all members that you do have the ability to contact Jonathan and Aidan at any time with regards to any areas of risk that you feel could or should be looked into. And of course, as chairman, I would appreciate being copied into that. Yes, Jonathan.
And Chairman, we do on this agenda, of course, have your work programme later where there is an opportunity for you to identify areas that you would like to focus on as members of this committee.
Councillor Legg.
A quick question, and it's really for the SWAT, is that right? Team here today. The thing which struck me in listening to Aidan's response was, well, if that's the case, how do we compare with other local authorities that are also audited by SWAP? And are we somewhere in the middle, somewhere lower down, somewhere at the top? Are you spending more time here than you spend with your other local authorities in the area? And I guess to a certain extent, the decisions about your employment and the numbers of people employed by SWAP, you base that on what local authorities say to you they want you to investigate and look at. So you can't just go out on a limb and do as much delving and digging and trying to dredge up things as you like. It's down to what local authorities ask you to look for.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a myriad of issues that you sort of raised there. I guess there is no professional standard of a set number of days required to provide an annual opinion. It is down to a proportionate approach, the opinion of the auditor, conversations with the council, and I would say that the number of days that we have at the moment are sufficient to provide an opinion to the council, which is very important. I would also emphasise that SWAP is also looking to be efficient in its approach. I have mentioned an Agile approach. We are very collaborative. We work with the officers, which provides an efficient approach to our audits. It takes less days. So there are a number of issues at play. I would also highlight that we talk to directorates about what they would find useful to include in the audit plan, but alongside that we undertake our own risk assessment, looking at the council's risk register. We also compare with our SWAP partners, so what are emerging risks coming out in other local authorities, and of course we horizon scan as well for anything that might be emerging. In terms of what we actually deliver to the council, there is a link on page 1 of the report, which is titled Internal Audit Rolling Plan. And if you click on that link, that will give you details of what we are working on currently, what we have completed, what we are proposing to audit across the forthcoming weeks, months, and potentially years.
Chairman, thank you. I imagine it's difficult for Sally to say this because if she says it, it will sound like an advertisement for SWAP. But I think one of the huge benefits that we get through having the South West Audit Partnership as our internal auditors is the breadth of experience that they get of a range of local authorities. Sally, I think, is it 26 or 20, somewhere in the high 20s, isn't it, that you... Right, 25 public authorities SWAP are the internal auditors for. And so whilst there might not necessarily be a particular audit might not involve a direct comparison between authorities, we do have the benefit of seeing what is happening elsewhere, and the auditors will bring their experience of what is happening in other authorities to compare how we are doing. But where we have, as an example, seen some direct comparison is around our the work around our fraud maturity and comparison with other authorities that SWAP are the auditors for. So we do get significant benefit from using as our internal auditors, not colleagues who are employed just within this organisation, but people who have a wider view of the public sector.
Thank you, Jonathan. For those members who don't know, I am Vice Chairman of the Regional Forum for Audit Chairs, and you hear quite a lot of discussion about internal audit from various providers, and I always feel somewhat assured by the service that SWAP do provide us. In an organisation the size of Dorset Council, there are always other things that we can look at. There are always things which members may feel that we should look at. But that is why we all have the ability to contact Jonathan or Aidan to try and look into certain areas. And as I said earlier, I would encourage any members, if you've got any concerns, any issues, any thoughts, do raise those with either Jonathan or Aidan, or of course if it's on that sort of risk management side, obviously to contact Mark Eyre as our service manager. I think the second thing to mention, and a reminder to most members, but to let our 2 new committee members know, that always on our SWAP reports there are links which Sally puts into a whole breadth of information, which gives you a far bigger picture than what just the general report does. And I would encourage everybody to click on those links and have that as part of your agenda reading when it comes to coming to these committee meetings. There are 2 points that I think that I would like to raise as chairman, which I've had these thoughts in the run-up to today's meetings, and the comments from members have helped reinforce that. So the first one I think is for Mark. When we hear about these outstanding actions and that some are now over 12 months old, and I do appreciate that the number now is significantly less than what it was, but I feel that this committee should have a regular agenda item which specifically looks at or hears the reasoning behind why some of these risks have not been addressed within that 12-month period. There's a bit of me that would like to actually think that that should be 6 months, because a risk is a risk and we need to be making sure that where possible, all the effort is done to mitigate those risks as timely as possible. So could I leave that in your hands, Mark, to perhaps talk with Jonathan outside of this meeting? But I think it's really important that even if it's bringing in service directors, that they can explain to us why certain things are not happening in a certain amount of time, because we're not involved in the day-to-day running of various departments, and therefore it's important to us, I feel, that we should have all of the information as possible, so that we either understand why certain risks take a long time to deal with, or perhaps it can act as a catalyst to along the sorting out of those risks. So can I leave that one with you? Yes, Mark.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I'll certainly take that away. I think what we've looked at for future reporting on risk to this committee is to change the approach slightly, with some of the detail going instead through to the scrutiny committees. But what that therefore means is that in many ways this committee has more of a sort of a performance overview of the actual risk management process. So I think as part of that, we can certainly build in something which looks at risks that have stayed at the same level for a prolonged period.
Yeah, and I appreciate everything you've said there, and I do understand where you're coming from. What I would like to see, though, is that this is brought back, as I say, as a regular standing item, and I want it to be a separate item. I really don't want it to be lost in a bigger report. I want this to be highlighted as a risk within itself, and therefore it needs to be dealt with and looked at accordingly, I feel. The second thing, Aidan, and to Jim, Sally has obviously highlighted the issue of debt. We have the figures in front of us. A number of members, including myself, are concerned by the level of debt. Again, I would like to see this as a regular item coming through to this committee, so that we understand whether the measures which are being put into place are having a positive effect, so that we can keep an eye on this, because I think it's really important. And as I say, bearing in mind now that we only meet half a dozen times a year, I would like that to be at every meeting, because obviously our next meeting now is September. That's quite a long time, so I would hope to see some positive moves in those figures? And if not, then that allows this committee to ask the proper questions as to why, etc. And Aidan, if you feel that it would be appropriate to get Gary Suttle in as the portfolio holder into those meetings as well, I would appreciate that. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. And if I should have said at the beginning, Gary Suttle had wanted to be here today, but has a medical appointment, so is unable to join us. But he's certainly, in our regular briefings on debt, he shares your concern and would like to discuss that with the committee on a regular basis. Yes.
Brilliant, thank you, members. That agenda item was to note, so we shall now move on to agenda item 6, which is the Honorary Alderman, Alderwoman of the Dorset Council area. We're being joined live by Jackie, and I think Jonathan is also going to be making some comments on this agenda item. Thank you.
Chairman,
thank you, Chair.
I won't comment on the substance of the agenda item, but I do just want to say something about the presentation of it. So Jackie Andrews, Service Manager for Democratic and Electoral Services, is going to be presenting the report remotely. I think that's the first time we've done this in your committee. One of the benefits of the webcasting kit that we've installed in the council chamber is that it's actually two-way, and it does enable an officer to present remotely. It enables a member of the public to ask their questions to you remotely. Now, I can see there are benefits in not having to travel. There are benefits in a reduced carbon impact, but perhaps outside the meeting, if members could feed back to me what the experience is this morning of having a remote presentation, and we can bear that in mind then for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Morning, Jackie. Over to you.
Thank you, Chairman, and good morning, committee members. And it's great to be able to join you virtually today, and I hope it works well so your views are positive. Just for the benefit of those who are watching a live stream, I'm Jackie Andrews, the Service Manager for Democratic and Electoral Services. So the report before members this morning follows a discussion between the Chairman and the Vice Chairman of Council and the political group leaders, and it seeks a recommendation to full Council to include a process in the Constitution to enable the conferring of the title of Honorary Alderman or Alderwoman on former members of Dorset Council. So the Local Government Act 1972 permits the Council to confer the title on a person who has, in the opinion of the Council, rendered eminent service as a former member. And while some of our predecessor councils made similar awards, this practice was not adopted by Dorset Council on its creation in 2019. So the proposal before you today, members, is to establish a mechanism within the Constitution to enable the conferring of the title of Honorary Alderman or Alderwoman to former members who've given a period of public service for a minimum of 16 years, and in addition are considered to have made an outstanding contribution to the area in their role as elected member. So the Act doesn't specify how eminent service is defined, and as such, that's been left as a matter for local interpretation. I would point out that the status of Honorary Alderman or Alderwoman is a purely honorary one in recognition of previous service, and it doesn't give any special status to attend or address meetings of council or any committee or subcommittee. When the agenda papers were published, I received a suggestion from one member that Council considers making the Honorary Alderman and Alderwoman of Dorset Council's predecessor councils Honorary Alderman or Alderwoman of Dorset Council. However, the Act does state that the Council could only confer the title on former members of Dorset Council, but for your information, I can advise that the Chairman does recognise the honour held by members of predecessor councils, and they're often invited to civic events. For example, most recently, the civic service celebrating Her Majesty's Platinum Jubilee. So the proposal is that the Council establishes a panel of members who will consider nominations for the title and make recommendations to a specially convened meeting of full Council. And the proposal is that the panel is made up of one member from each of the political groups in place at that time, appointed by their group leaders, and also the Chairman and Vice Chairman of Council. So the Act requires that the conferring such a title should be undertaken at a meeting of full council specially convened for this purpose, where not less than 2/3 of the members present must vote in favour of bestowing the honour. For practical purposes, the specially convened meeting would be held immediately prior to a scheduled full council meeting, rather than bringing all members together for this one item. So in summary, Chairman, the suggested criteria for the nominations is that the nominee is retired from Dorset Council, which is a statutory requirement, and also that the nominee has served a minimum of 16 years, which can include service on any of Dorset Council's predecessor councils. And the additional criteria is that the nominee is considered to have made an outstanding contribution in their role as elected member. You'll see in the report that it's intended that any person who is bestowed the title of Honorary Alderman or Alderwoman would receive a badge and a certificate in recognition of the honour. And it's likely that the cost of supplying a badge and a certificate would be approximately £100, based on us making a minimum order of 10 badges. But this cost would be met from the existing Chairman's budget, so there's no proposal to seek any additional funding for this. Chairman, the committee is asked to make a recommendation to full council to include this process and the criteria in the constitution, and I'm very happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Jackie. Any questions from members? Councillor Pipe.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for your report. Although the audio is a bit, I didn't pick up a few points that I'd have liked to have picked up. Could you just say the 16 years total? Did I hear you say that does take into account time served with previous councils, district council and perhaps county council?
Councillor Pipe, that's correct. So service on any of Dorset Council's predecessor councils, so that would be Dorset County Council, East Dorset, Purbeck District, West Dorset, Weymouth and Portland, and I've forgotten one, East, West, North, Purbeck, Weymouth and Portland and Dorset County Council.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that. So, for instance, somebody served 12 years, let's say, on East Dorset District Council, so it can't be me, because I was Purbeck. Then he served alongside that service at East Dorset Council for, say, 4 years on Dorset County Council. Would that 4 be added to the other service, or does that not count?
I believe the intention of the chairman and vice chairman and the group leaders was that there should be 16 separate years. So it would be, it would necessitate perhaps 12 years with East Dorset, which includes the 4 years with the county council, plus additional 4 years with Dorset Council.
Okay, so they wouldn't run together. Okay, that's fine. And any service on town councils, is that recognised as service or not?
That wasn't the intention of the chairman and vice chairman and political group leaders. Their recommendation is that it is service on a principal council.
Okay, that's absolutely fine. Thank you very much for your answers.
Councillor Legg.
Well, I think that in part answers one of the questions that I was going to ask. So basically, twin hatters can't count that as double time to get their 16 years in. I ought to declare an interest, really. I've clocked up 38 years now, and I do have a set of whiskey tumblers which Dorset County Council presented me, embossed with or engraved rather, with the crest of Dorset County Council. But I think that was the standard thing which you handed out to all employees who'd done 25 years service. I just wonder how this is going to work. It could work quite well, and I remember sitting in this chamber when I think it might have been a member of the Bond family or maybe the Weld family who were introduced and given the honorary status of an alderman. They sat at the back for part of a council meeting. It could work quite well. And on the other hand, it could work really rather badly. I wouldn't like to think that a committee would say, yes, let's put Mr. Legg on the list. And then it got to a meeting of the chamber and all hell broke loose. And Mr. Legg was slated in public as being an unworthy recipient. I'm just thinking of how, this could work well or it could work really, really badly. It could be like sledging in overdrive. So I hope that, we actually exercise a degree of thought processes, because you've got to get, 2/3? A majority of people voting in the chamber, which, might be a bit of a challenge on some occasions. So I hope this is done well as opposed to badly.
Jonathan, you want to come back on that one?
Yes, so Chairman, the formal position is that the decision would have to be made by the full council on that 2/3 majority that Jackie has already mentioned. I would hope and expect, though, that the full council would respect the detailed work that would have been done by the panel on a cross-group basis with representatives of each of the political groups, would respect the views and the work that had been done in detail in that panel, and not get into a debate about the merits of the contributions and the eminence of the contributions made by individual members. That should be happening that work should be done outside the chamber, and we shouldn't be in a position where someone is coming forward and being recommended to become an honorary alderwoman or alderman, where other members wouldn't necessarily respect and agree with that. Thank you.
Jonathan, I presumed as part of your day job, as it were, that you would be monitoring this process anyway, and if you saw any needs for tweaks or alterations, you would bring that back to this committee anyway.
Yes, Chairman, that's right.
Any other questions from members? Councillor Christopher.
I feel compelled to ask the question, where does the time period of 16 years come from? Chair, you and I worked with one particular councillor who came from the West, the old West Dorset District Councillor, who had a financial services background, who had worked in New York, who had worked in the Far East, and who did an enormous amount of work in his 4 years at West Dorset Council, and then decided he wouldn't put his name forward. And clearly there is a risk that there will be some people, just like that gentleman, who we knew for those 4 years, who made a fundamental difference to West Dorset District Council and had a huge input into the work of the Shadow Council, and who would not be recognised because he only served 4 years. I know that's the past, but I am concerned about the 16-year period and the fact that this will only go to people who have served their time. And where does the 16 years come from? Clearly, the importance is what people actually achieve. And if you can't remember the name of the person who was on the West Dorset District Council Cabinet, then I will remind you after the meeting. Thank you.
I think, Councillor Christopher, you're right. I mean, in essence, where does that 16 years come from? Who's made that decision? Was it done for a particular reason? And as Councillor Christopher mentioned, there are many of us in this room today who stood for election in 2019, but there's an awful lot of water to go under the bridge between now and the next election. And each of us in here could do fantastic things for the community or the county in general, but then there's no recognition of it. It does, and I appreciate that this is a recommendation from the Chair of Council and the Vice Chair, and I appreciate that this is for the Principal Council. But when we're doing something like this, I think we should be recognising some of the work which is done by town and parish councillors across this county. I think yourself, Councillor Christopher, Councillor Biggs and Councillor Legg will remember there was a lady who was recognised from, I believe it was All Western Parish Council, for I think it was 30 years or 40 years dedication. And I just think if we're doing something like this, there should be a bit more than just what could be perceived by some people as the council patting itself on the back. Jonathan, you're looking as though you want to come back.
Microphone. Thank you, Chairman. So I think Jackie will be able to comment on where the 16 years comes from, but I think, Chairman, an easy tweak to the criteria might be, for instance, to insert the word in 2.3 of the report, second bullet point, should ordinarily have served a minimum of 16 years. I think that 16 years reflects a significant time commitment, as well as individual contributions during a member's time in office. I don't believe that we are in a position to recognise as an older woman or alderman of this council someone who has only served as a town or parish councillor. These are people you are recognising as councillors who have contributed as members of this council or one of the predecessor councils. So you're not able to do that in relation to town and parish councillors.
Jackie, did you want to come back on the issue of the 16 years?
Yes, Chairman, thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, sorry. Yeah, the 16 years, the Chairman, Vice Chairman and Group Leaders gave a significant amount of thought to the 16 years, and they wanted to ensure that that the award was very special, and they felt that the 16 years would show a certain period of time serving the public in Dorset Council. And as Jonathan's indicated, the Alderman honour cannot be given to people who have not served as a Dorset councillor. However, there is another award that the Local Government Act enables the council to confer, and that is the title of Honorary Freeman or Free Woman of Dorset Council, and that's an award that can be given to anybody, including an organisation that the Dorset Council believes should be recognised for an exceptional contribution to the area. But this report doesn't cover those type of awards. It just covers the Alderman or Alderwoman awards, which can only be given to former councillors. And it was felt important to have a distinction between the Freeman and Alderman and Free Woman and Alderwoman titles, to differentiate those that have served the community as non-elected members and those that have served the community as elected members. But the 16 years was just to make the award really special. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Jackie. Councillor Biggs.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely right that there is a minimum period. I think you're into a whole can of worms if you start saying somebody's 4 years, even though they may have done outstanding contribution during that period. I think that the difficult conversations of, you know, who did this and that, and at the end of the day, they could always been put forward for a national award, OBE or whatever, if they did something really exceptional during that period. I think the fact that people put themselves forward time and time again and get re-elected and deal with a lot of casework that's not seen, and put their family sometimes second place through that period is something that should be recognised, I think. It's not always an enjoyable job. I think it's fair to say some of relation to me. Do you still enjoy being on the council? I pause because I don't always enjoy it, but it is something sort of civic duty, isn't it? And some of you may disagree, but I absolutely love every minute of it, but that's my personal opinion. I think there is. It's not something that I'm sure the public are going to be particularly too bothered one way or the other, but I think that this is available for us to do. I think 16 years is a reasonable time, and I think it's something that we should support. Thank you.
Any other questions or points from members? Councillor Pipe.
Thank you. For those of us who served on previous councils, county council and your district councils, and now this council, I think that's it's going to be quite easy for them to possibly reach that 16 year threshold. But for the new members who represent areas within only the new council, the Dorset Council area, will in fact have to serve 4 terms to qualify, as we are on 5-year electoral cycles here. So they will serve 3, which is 15, and they will have to be re-elected for a 4th term to actually qualify. Is there any chance or possibility or even a suggestion that the limit be reduced by 1 year to 15 so that members of this council could possibly qualify without serving 20 years or possibly up to 20 years?
I think if I remember rightly, we're on 2 5 years and then a 4-year. Jonathan?
Chairman, the first 2 terms of this council are for 5 years. We then revert to a 4-year term. It doesn't alter the substance, I think, of Councillor Pipe's point, that someone would still have to be elected for a 4th term and to serve a 4th term if they've not been a member of a predecessor council in order to be considered. And there is, of course, the wider point is it isn't just time served. It is reaching that qualifying period of time and being judged by your peers to have given particularly eminent service that goes over and above time served. Chairman, my suggestion, if this will help, is that in the second bullet point, in paragraph 2.3, you could insert the word ordinarily so that the nominee shall ordinarily have served a minimum of 16 years. That enables the cross-party panel to come to a view if they think that somebody has served slightly less but has still provided particularly eminent service on an exceptional basis that they could justify to the rest of the council. They could still be recommended as an honorary alderwoman, honorary alderman.
Thank you, Jonathan. Yes, Councillor Pipe.
I welcome that suggestion by the monitoring officer, Chairman, and I would certainly, I'd certainly back that. And thank you.
Councillor Christopher.
I feel compelled to say that I still maintain that 16 years is too long a period. You yourself may reflect on your own political career and whether it will get to 16 years. And you have done a lot. I know the answer to the question, Chair. I know the answer to the question. But I feel compelled to say that I still believe that 16 years is too long. And I'll let members reflect on the political career of Mo Mowlam. Now, Mo Mowlam was only a Member of Parliament for 14 years, but I don't think anybody would argue that she didn't play a huge part in our national life. So I want to use that as an example that 16 years is perhaps too long a period for this to assess the contribution of people, and you may well end up with people who serve a lesser period of time not being considered, whilst other people will serve a great many years and perhaps not necessarily achieve quite as much as people do in a shorter period of time. And I refer you back to the gentleman who represented West Dorset District Council, was on their cabinet and did so much towards the shadow cabinet and moving this forward as a Dorset councillor. Thank you.
I think in some respects, I agree with you about the issue of time, But I think the suggestion by the monitoring officer of adding in that ordinarily should allow those who've made a distinct impact on their ward or their area or their level of expertise within the council to be recommended by group leaders for this position to go forwards. No, I will not reach 16 years. If there are no other comments, we'll move to the motion, which is the full council be asked to agree to amend the Constitution to include the criteria and process for awarding the title of Honorary Alderman, Alderwoman for former members of Dorset Council. Do I have a proposer for that with the alteration suggested by Jonathan Mayer at 2.3? Councillor Pipe proposes. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Legg. All those in favour? That is everybody other than Councillor Gorringe, who I presume you're not voting as your vice. Sorry.
On the committee.
Thank you very much, everybody. Now, if we move on to agenda item number 7, you'll have to bear with me. My computer is having a slight tantrum. So this is the LGA Finance Peer Challenge update. Aidan Dunn and Jim McManus.
Thanks, Chair. It's coming for information, really, this report. Members recall the Local Government Association peer review that Dorset Council undertook shortly after it was established in 2019 as part of its signal of support for sector-led improvement. As well as that exercise for the overall organisation, a finance-specific peer challenge was also undertaken in the spring of 2021, with the Council inviting a team of peers from the LGA to review our financial position, and that included a specific piece of focus work around management of the dedicated schools grant, particularly the high needs block. The report and recommendations went to Cabinet on the 5th of October 21. I think there might be a typo in my report there. We haven't got to October 22 yet, I don't think. And with the Council's responses and a work plan, and the Finance Peer Challenge team returned for a follow-up event in March this year. So their findings are summarised in the note of that date, which is required to be published. It's been to Cabinet yesterday, coming to this committee today for information. So I don't have anything more to say about it. I'm happy to take questions if we can. I suppose just reflecting on some of the conversation we had this morning about the level of internal audit work, I suppose this is another layer of assurance from peers looking at the organisation about how it operates, things where we can improve and so on. So just making that connection as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Questions, members? Councillor Legg.
As a new member of the committee, are they likely to come back and visit us soon? And if they do so, what will they be looking at on that occasion?
Thank you. In terms of this particular piece of finance peer review, the set piece programme is a big intensive review and then a follow-up 6 to 9 months later. But as part of our ongoing development, we've got a session scheduled for October, which is where the original peer review team, not the finance peer review team, but the council peer review team, are coming alongside 1 or 2 members from the finance peer review team, and just to kind of check in and see how we're progressing. So the finance peer review is pretty much finished, but the general sense of peer-based challenge continues, and the next thing will be October time.
Any other questions or points from members? Councillor Pipe.
Thank you, Chairman. The finance peer review, as I've read it, is good news for Dorset. I think it tells that there is a very sound commercial approach by Dorset Council to its finances, and I commend it to the committee. It's absolutely good news. And thank you to the team who sit behind me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Pipe. I agree this is very positive for this council. I will make two slight points as I look at Aidan and Jim. The first one is just, it's a concern I've had with councils now over a number of years. And the phrase again is used on page 4 of the report where it says deleting vacant posts. It does always worry me that we might end up deleting the wrong post, and I just hope that a thorough review of any vacant posts is carried out before those posts are deleted. And the other comment, again on page 4, is that phrase of generating income. And I hope as we move along with this council that we see, shall we say, a little more meat on the bones of that statement. You know, it's generating income is not just about putting charges up. It needs to be a whole lot more than that. As there's no other questions, members, and I believe that the recommendation is to receive and review, we don't need to take a vote on that one. So if we now move on to the agenda item number 8, learning from the Code of Conduct and Localism Act complaints. This has taken up a huge amount of my time and Jonathan's time since the formation of this council. In fact, at times it's staggering the amount of time it has taken up. The report is being presented today to us by Anthony Bygrave. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman, councillors, members and colleagues. I'm Anthony Bygrave. I manage the corporate complaints team in assurance under Mark Eyre and monitoring officer Jonathan. January the 1st, we were presented with a delegated responsibility to triage and manage councillor conduct complaints. And as I'm very passionate about the complaints that come in across the directorates and my own experiences in managing complaints that have doubled in 2 years, my immediate thought was, well, what can we do to hold up a mirror to perhaps analyse, identify any trends or learn from complaints? Because the culture of learning is the same for councillor conduct in my mind, and I think Dorset Council's mind, as it should be for any complaint that the general public or other councillors wanted to make. So in the true spirit of Bygrave charm, I would like to start by thanking the councillors for the tremendous amount of work and support we've had in dealing with complaints generally, because again, in my experience, it's really clear a lot of these concerns are actually filtered before they even get into Dorset Council's own complaints processes. So this is not intended as a critique in any way, but it is a reflection, I think, on some of the figures that have come in the last 2 years, considering that the number of councillors, there are so circa 1,400, to get the numbers through that we are, you might think, actually, it's not really a big number. We're sort of talking about 54 complaints last year, 60 more recently, so there's a slight increase. But what I think we were, and certainly what the Chair was alluding to, is just how much time, and in some cases money, some of these investigations take. If we're paying £30 an hour to independent people to investigate, to take a view on something which might actually be served by an apology and perhaps a step back, a little bit of time, a little bit of reflection. And you'd be surprised how many of the complaint forms that come through with absolutely not, I don't want an apology. And one gets the sense, excuse me, one gets the sense that in many cases perhaps an apology would suffice. And one of my early observations is a lot of the complaints that are coming in about councillor conducts are from other councillors. So I think without making recommendations in this report, again, it's really just to reflect, identify some trends, which I think are really self-explanatory. If you've had a chance to look at section 1.5, those trends are really quite staggering in terms of the proportion of town and parish complaints that come in, and how few that are actually really upheld, and how little substance there is to some of them. And one perhaps reflects a little bit and thinks, you know, in the first instance, would an apology really have been enough to put that matter right? And I'm surprised a little bit that more often than not, that's not acceptable for people. The other trend, which I think is coming out a little bit from my early observations, excuse me, is use of social media. And I think one can forget that councillors are still councillors in the eyes of the general public, whether they're acting as a councillor or not. And I think that is probably quite unfair in some cases, because councillors are still very much entitled to their own opinions. In fact, we rely on those opinions. But use of the social media, I think sometimes, even if it's just personal, it can be interpreted in a certain way. And where there is a breach of the code potentially by not treating people with respect, that's what people come forward with, that there's a suggestion that maybe that is a show of disrespect. In my own experience, I think it's probably a disagreement of opinion, and I think we really need to be clear that disagreements with people's opinions, which are sometimes strong, of why councillors are here. That isn't necessarily a breach of the code of the conduct. So again, I think particularly if a councillor themselves are making a complaint about other councillors, is perhaps just to take a moment, is it really a breach of the code, or is it a disagreement of opinion? And if so, is an apology enough? Because very, very time consuming, very expensive. Equally, if there is a point at the heart of it, and it is a genuine breach of the code of conduct, we'd expect to take it seriously and to follow due course. But what we are seeing in the figures is that's very seldom the case. So I can take any questions. I'm hoping it's a really self-explanatory report, and the figures speak for themselves. But if there is any clarification I can provide, please let me know.
Any questions and points from members? Councillor Legg first.
Has anybody said anything to the council collectively in Shaftesbury? Because they have a staggering number of issues that have cropped up in, what is it, something like about just over 18 months, 37, and 14 complaints to the police over a period of 8 years. My recollection of over the years reading the old Blackmore Vale magazine was there was something odd about Shaftesbury Town Council. I shouldn't really be saying this, should I? Because that will probably draw complaints. But they always seem to be at one another's throats. And I'm just wondering whether, as part of this process, since they are taking up a very significant amount of time and costing a lot of money for the overall people of this county, has anybody actually thought of knocking on their door and saying, what is the problem here? Because it does seem to stretch back, not just over the last 18 months or so, but decades.
Councillor Legg, before Jonathan answers in a very diplomatic way to that one, the next time we have a code of conduct hearing that involves Shaftesbury, we'll invite you along. Jonathan.
Chairman, I think it will be apparent to all members from the table in the report that Shaftesbury is an outlier. Shaftesbury does stand out as a council that has, some of its members have received far more complaints than any other. What that also masks, simply seeing the figure set out there, is that usually those complaints, not exclusively, but those are largely councillor-on-councillor complaints. And what it also masks is some of the complexity. So Shaftesbury is one of the councils where complaints have escalated to a hearing subcommittee where we've had to spend a very great deal of time. So whilst you might have a dozen complaints that go nowhere, they just involve the time of an independent person, the independent people who give their valuable time to assist Dorset Council in giving an independent view about complaints, they might look at a complaint and say no further action is justified, or they might recommend some informal resolution. We know that with Shaftesbury, a significant number of complaints have been escalated to a panel of councillors, and the result is we've had to spend very considerable member and officer time in trying to bring about resolutions. The glimmer of hope that I see in all of this is that Shaftesbury have got a new town clerk. They're a council that has had quite a high turnover of clerks, but they've got a new clerk, and I'm seeing, as I say, some glimmers of hope in less extreme behaviour amongst some individual councillors. Chairman, I'm also conscious that we've got in the council chamber this morning Neil Wedge, who is the chairman of the chief executive, of Dorset Association of Parish and Town Councils. And if you're agreeable to do that, if members wanted to, then Neil has a particular perspective that he'll be able to bring to bear. And Neil might also be able to speak about his national work around civility and respect amongst councillors.
Yes, I'll come on to Neil shortly. And before I go on to Councillor Pipe, can I just ask Anthony, with these figures, so we've had an example before, I think, where one councillor has complained about 10 others. In your figures, is that classed as one complaint or 10 complaints?
Thank you, Chair. Really, really good point, actually. But we are classing it as one one complaint on this occasion. But there is an argument that that is 10 different complaints. So you raise a very good point.
Councillor Pipe.
Have we got a mic on? There we go. Thank you, Chairman. I've been involved in the governance side of audit and governance for many years at Purbeck District Council, at Dorset County Council, and now at Dorset Council. And whenever the word Shaftesbury hits your screen, it's a big groan. And going back a few years, there were other councils as well, which I won't name. But as Jonathan's already alluded to, very little comes out of these complaints. You may hold a complaint up against one of the town councillors, any councillor, not necessarily Shaftesbury, but I do hope that with the appointment of a new clerk and a turnover of some of the older members who feature regularly on the emails that both you get and I get, it will quieten down a bit. The Dorset police numbers, are they totally separate from the Dorset Council ones, or are they included with that? Oh, beg your pardon.
Chairman, we might need to do a bit of a double act in answering this one, but just as a reminder to members, with the part of the Code of Conduct, councillor behaviour that you deal with, that is about behaviours, treating each other with respect, for instance. The police deal particularly with Localism Act offences, where there are allegations that a councillor has failed to disclose their financial interests fully. And in the procedure that you recommended and the council adopted, if we receive an allegation that a councillor has failed to register their financial interests, we send that straight to the police. We don't investigate it through our procedures at all. Now, behind that, we might get a complaint which is about two things, both behaviour and a failure to register interests. So that could result in a double counting. But obviously what's clearly coming through the figures is that not only are you receiving a very high number of complaints about the behaviour of Shaftesbury town councillors, but the police are receiving a high number of complaints that councillors have failed to register their financial interests in that council?
Councillor Pipe.
Thank you to the monitoring officer. If a complaint originates to you and you refer it to the police, that's one on your tally and one on the police, or are the police ones only where the complainant actually goes to the police? Are they, or do they include referrals from Dorset councils and all councils and councillors monitoring officer, Mr. Mayor? I'm trying to get down to the numbers here.
Yeah, again, really good point. There was a changing of the baton in terms of how the complaints were managed sort of last calendar year to this calendar year. What's coming in, if we treat a complaint to Dorset Council as a complaint to Dorset Council because it involves consideration, work, and it's part of the numbers that make up the total number. So the outcome would be different. So when we report the outcomes, it would be clear what the outcome was. But in terms of the numbers, it would feature as a number that's coming through the Code of Conduct portal. Thanks.
Councillor Cocking.
Chair. I think obviously Anthony alluded to it in his report. I think with the public and a lot of councillors, obviously social media has had a huge impact on the amount of complaints. And I think sometimes that needs to be fed back to the public and councillors, that if people put comments on Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or whatever, councillors need to be aware of how that's perceived by the public, and the public need to be aware of that's not necessarily a code of conduct complaint. And I think there's another thing as well, is I think councillors and the public get frustrated about the code of conduct, as in sometimes it's not robust enough in its sanctions. And so I feel that sometimes complaints can come back about certain councillors or certain councils because people get frustrated and fed up that they see the same people being, to them, breaking a law or the code of conduct. But with social media, it's not really recognised in the code of conduct. And so sometimes I think as councillors, when we sit on the subcommittees, sometimes we get frustrated that we feel that the behaviours aren't that of a councillor, but the actual sanctions aren't really strong enough to actually change that behaviour of those councils or those councillors. And that's why we keep getting repeat offenders, if you want to call them offenders. So I think there's two things in hand. You know, the public get frustrated and perceive that, they're breaking the law or they're breaking the code of conduct by posting things on Facebook or doing just other things that they don't perceive a councillor should be doing. And again, the sanctions are not there to punish, if you want to use that word, the councillors for what they feel is wrongdoing. And I think that's why we get repeat complaints about certain, but I've sat on the Shaftesbury's ones, as you both know we have, and it is the same thing, it's the same people. And I think that's, the frustration is there with everyone as well. So that's just my perception of the code of conduct needs to be a little bit more robust.
Jonathan, did you want to come back on that?
Chairman, thank you. I think those are really important points. The sanctions that are available to this council are prescribed by the Localism Act. And we know that prior to the Localism Act, there was an ability to suspend councillors responsible for the most extreme behaviour, the ability even nationally to disqualify someone from being a councillor. Those sanctions are gone now, and we don't have those. I think, though, we're a bit smarter now in the sanctions that we do have, and in some of the recent complaints that panels have dealt with, I think we've been able to come up with some sanctions that were perhaps a little more meaningful. But I think before we get into sanctions, there are a couple of points. One is that, as the report recognises, the 1,400 town and parish councillors in Dorset doing an incredible amount of hard work in their communities. Very few of those are even on our radar, on your radar as a committee, because these are simply people who are working incredibly hard. The numbers that come forward are small in comparison. There's also a really important point about training, and I don't want to big up Neil's part too much, but I think that Neil will be able to talk to you about the training that is available to councillors that will help to address some of these themes that we're seeing come through in complaints, particularly around the use of social media, where perhaps being a little more self-aware will help to avoid the potential for complaints. What we're not going to be able to stop are the most extremes of behaviours, where we've had some really straightforwardly wrong behaviour, wholly inappropriate behaviour over social media. Racism in particular, references to people as gollywogs, things that are completely and utterly unacceptable, but which, because somebody was not acting as a councillor at the time, was making private personal comments, we haven't got the ability to address those because the code of conduct doesn't apply to somebody when acting in a personal capacity. But I think training does have a really important part to play around those, for those who simply need to be a little more self-aware when they're on a public platform on social media. Thank you.
Councillor Borden.
Is that on? Yeah. Yes, thank you. Councillor Belinda Borden from Lyme Regis and Charmouth. I'd just like to endorse what my colleague here's just said. I think that the sanctions are not strong enough. They're not perceived either by the public or by town and parish councillors as being strong enough, and therefore they see there's no point in making a complaint to some extent. And I think also it risks putting people off applying to be a councillor. We've certainly experienced that recently in Lyme Regis. At the same time that the by-election for this seat was held, there was also a town councillor vacancy and nobody put their names forward. Luckily we did have an election in May, but I do think it's quite serious that people are genuinely being put off, being part of the democratic process. So I don't know if there's any way that can be addressed or that the sanctions can be improved.
I'll come on to that shortly. Councillor Biggs?
Yes, certainly I've been on a number of these, and it's just similar themes that crop up over and over again. I mean, we're always told that the sanctions are set nationally. And I think there's also, quite a debate, isn't there, about freedom of expression. And I personally perhaps I would just caution about having too many powers. I think the previous system was equally flawed and that it was abused and that people were given sort of overbearing punishment, sometimes one person's word against another, and it gets very difficult. I'd be interested in hear what Mr. Wedge says. And perhaps my observation also is not just councillors who obviously got that responsible duty, but I think particularly observation was that many times the town clerks didn't intervene when they should have done. It was clear that they were often the recipient of bullying behaviour and perhaps didn't feel able to stand up to people. So I think that training needs to go right across the board. So I'd be very interested to see how that could be strengthened. But I'd be reluctant to see the powers increase. I think that was just another minefield to be opened. Thank you.
Before I come on to Neil Wedge and following on from Councillor Borden's comments, Jonathan, as I'm sure you are, you will have noticed, shall we say, the frustration within this room with what is happening in Shaftesbury, the issues which are raised and the continuing problems that come from that. I'm wondering if there is any mileage in yourself, Anthony, myself, actually getting the LGA down here to provide them with the evidence of what is happening or has happened in Shaftesbury as the main example, and say, what are we supposed to do with this system? You know, we have to highlight to somebody in the powers that be that the current system is flawed, and I can't sit here and say I've got the answer to most of those, but we need to be highlighting, because we won't be the only council in this country who is having that type of issue, and we need help for ourselves to be able to deal with the types of the Shaftesbury example, not only for ourselves as a committee and as a council, but also to help Shaftesbury councillors themselves and the residents of Shaftesbury. Because, of course, all the time councillors are, shall we say, in a position where there is anger, frustration between themselves. Their mind isn't perhaps focused on their residents as much as possibly it should be. And I welcome your thoughts on that. I just feel that we've gone on long enough now with frustrations boiling over. Like Councillor Biggs, I'm interested to see what Neil Wedge has to say from DAPTC, but I think we as an organisation need to be going to somebody higher up and saying, this isn't working.
Chairman, I wonder if the appropriate person, the body we should be talking to, is not so much the Local Government Association, but perhaps we can have a conversation outside of this meeting about that. But perhaps it's around a representation to the Committee on Standards in Public Life. Because certainly there have been proposals brought forward for a more rigorous standards regime, not going as far as it used to be, but perhaps introducing some more real sanctions. Jim, the other point for me is around, I don't want to demonise Shaftesbury, because Shaftesbury, as I said, I've started to see those glimmers of hope. But I wonder if we do need some slightly different arrangement in place for complaints about what is an outlying council, so that if I've handed over the baton of the day-to-day handling of those complaints to the complaints team, but I wonder if we should single out those complaints, and where complaints come in about Shaftesbury as an outlier, those are escalated to me in consultation with you, so that we make, so that we can perhaps apply a more robust approach to what might sometimes be tit-for-tat complaints, and make sure that they do not take up officer time unnecessarily, but we deal with them quite robustly.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good morning, Neil Wedge. Pleasure to see you, and as I'm sure you can ascertain from the comments from my fellow councillors, we are looking to DAPTC for help and assistance with the process, we'll call it that, and we're very interested to hear your plans, your thoughts, and how you're looking at training, and perhaps whether that training will evolve, and whether there's anything else that we can do to help and to assist you. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I very much welcome this report and the opportunity to say a few words. Importantly, conduct is a topic that is probably for the majority of parish and town councils not that high up the agenda, because it's not actually a problem. And just to reiterate some of the points that have been mentioned, this is a minority of situations and circumstances that we're talking about. But unfortunately, although it's a minority, the consequences and impacts of poor conduct in councils has quite significant ramifications, not only in terms of time taken to try and resolve these issues, and often they're not resolved satisfactorily, but also a significant cost. And I guess my observations, and the reason I welcome this report, is I would like to see some further transparency and a level of detail around the costs of conduct, particularly in this small number of cases, because I feel by and large a lot of our member councils across the county and nationally probably don't understand and fully appreciate the expenditure and cost to the public purse in terms of resource time, because the figures that you've looked at today are in truth only a small proportion of the amount of time and commitment and cost that's incurred, because you're talking about complaints that have actually formally been lodged. There is and are a number of circumstances around these individual councils and others not on the report that take a considerable amount of my time and my team's time and those of the monitoring officer and the complaints team. So it is a snapshot, and that's one thing that I would sort of stress to everybody to understand. This isn't the full extent of the cost and the time taken around conduct. I'd rather focus very much on outcomes and solutions rather than actually sanctions, and I'll explain that briefly, because whilst I do agree that sanctions could be strengthened, I have little faith that they will be strengthened quickly and to the extent that they will actually be of practical use. So I've really turned my attention to the things that we can do. So I welcome some more visibility around complaints, particularly in the Council at Dorset, and it's something I'm going to try and encourage my counterparts across other counties to look at as well as part of some national work that we're doing. But one of the things, and some of the things that we've done locally in Dorset to try and address this point, is that we've put in place now regular training. So every single month of the year, there is code of conduct training and training around the register of interest process that was introduced last year. So previously, we would normally do conduct training once we had a bulk of councillors available to undertake the training. We've now taken the view that we want to encourage parish and town councillors that are new to their roles to be brought into the loop and briefed around the code of conduct within their first 5 or 6 weeks of becoming a councillor. That coincides with their declaration and their register of interest to make sure that everything is above board. So that's a practical thing that we can do, and we've changed within the last year to try and raise the awareness and consciousness of conduct with all of the new councillors. What we're also doing is developing different forms of learning around the same topic. So as well as having face-to-face training, we're recognising the fact that e-learning and encouraging councillors to come along to training and undertake the sort of briefings and some sort of short assessment around conduct can be done in a number of different ways, removing the obstacles that we've previously had around travel, time and cost. So all of those are very low cost options. So the excuses we've had before, we're trying to sort of remove, and we're trying to get more and more people through the sort of sausage machine that we call sort of code of conduct training. So I think there's some positive things being done, and nationally, our national body, the National Association of Local Councils, is working with Society of Local Council Clerks, because this is a hot topic for a lot of employees. They are working on a number of solutions that we will hopefully be able to deploy at the point that these issues start to evolve before they get to complaint stage. So I'm a bit more reassured that we've got a view of some of the practical things that we can do in advance of these reaching a formal complaint to try and actually address some of the numbers. The numbers in Dorset are stubbornly static, and we very much like to see those move in the right direction. We've done some good work in conjunction with Dorset Council around the register of interest, the adoption of the recent LGA new code, and we'll continue to do that work to try and keep it in everybody's consciousness But I am mindful that we need some subtle interventions where we have these individual cases that appear very corrosive and divisive, because just to finish, we have a problem recruiting and retaining councillors, and we have lost some very, very good community-spirited councillors simply because of conduct, and that's a sad situation to be in. We've got an election coming up in under 2 years, and effectively it'd be great if we've got some things in place that would encourage more people to represent their local communities. And I see this as one of the unfortunate unintended consequences of poor behaviour and poor conduct. And if we can actually start to manage that a bit better and inform people a bit better, we should start to make some progress. But it is quite hard work, it's quite time consuming, and I would just encourage that we actually get a bit more granular detail, so we understand a bit more about whether it is actually emanating from councillor versus councillor, whether it's member of the public, or whether it is actually employees and councillors. And I think that's where we need to get a bit more detail and a bit more transparency. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. There's a couple of points that I would like to ask you. The first one, and I'm not sure if other members would find it helpful, but if you could send us a copy of the training for the code of conduct that you do, I think that might be helpful for members. It will help us to understand the process that town and parish councillors are going through, but it also might be that we perhaps pick up something where we could say to you, perhaps if you could tweak this or alter this, that would be very helpful. I don't know whether Jonathan would agree with this, but I'm very interested and assured by the fact that you've got what I would class as a more robust training system on board. And I think it would be helpful for us as a council to know which councils have taken up your training offer. Because, of course, one of the things that we can look at when a complaint comes to us is whether actually people haven't had any training and whether they need to have that training. So if we were able to have perhaps that data, it might be helpful. I'm not sure whether that would be okay with you because of GDPR, etc., or what Jonathan thinks.
We have that information, and I think this is part of the suite of information I would like to be more visible. I certainly would be quite happy to write to our members to share who has taken part. We actually have an annual exercise where we recognise councils that support training, not just conduct training, but training generally. So I would like to have this more visible and probably a focus on it, because last year we trained somewhere in the order of about 800 councillors on conduct and on the register of interest process, and we have a high take-up of the new LGA code of conduct. But I would welcome the opportunity to do that. We certainly have a picture of that. A lot of it's predicated on individual member council budgets having an allocation for training, and actually there's an education piece there that we need to keep putting across. And then also we have a hardcore of councillors, I suspect, that see very little value in training that they've either been to or never actually witnessed or seen. So we've quite a bit of work to do on that. We can't make it mandatory, but certainly what we're trying to do is through the pricing of it and the availability and timing of it, we're trying to make it as easy as possible and accessible as possible to all councillors, and we'll continue to do so.
Chairman, you've had several comments about granular detail, and Anthony has spoken about the value of learning from complaints. And there is a really important link between the themes that we see coming through complaints, for instance, complaints about social media, and then the training that is made available for town and parish councillors and the focus of that training. So I think that's really helpful and reinforces what we need to be doing in terms of providing DAPTC with some of the themes and the detail that we see coming through complaints. I think, Chairman, I'm still left with that very obvious outlier of Shaftesbury in this paper. And I think it would be helpful to me, helpful to Anthony and the complaint complaints team if we were to get to a position where we had a little bit more of a robust gateway for complaints that concern that particular the council. Those should be triggering a little more closer attention from us that might lead us to bring those complaints to an earlier conclusion than might otherwise be the case. And we might be rejecting them at a very early stage in the complaints process before we effectively waste time on complaints that we might ultimately conclude are vexatious, are tit for tat, and a part of some ongoing long-term problems and relationship problems between individual councillors.
Yes, there's two things that comes from that, and I'll do the second bit first. I understand your point about we need to analyse, what is in essence a tit-for-tat scenario, but I think it would be wrong now, after 3 years, for us to, in essence, either label something as a tit-for-tat or to not say in a certain council, like, for example, the Shaftesbury scenario, that actually it doesn't warrant our investigation. Because actually just saying no to somebody in a situation like that actually doesn't help. And I think we need to look at a way of, whether it's ourselves working with DAPTC, to try and find a better resolution than just to say, I'm sorry, that your complaint is not a valid one for whatever reason. Your first point about wanting to make sure that a situation, an outlier like Shaftesbury, has a different way of being dealt with or prioritised. I like that idea, and I think that is something that actually could benefit Shaftesbury itself. Do you need to do that as an agenda item to come to our next committee meeting? How are you looking at dealing with that scenario?
I don't think it needs an agenda item, Chairman. I don't think it needs specific agreement from the committee. It's around, I think, if you're happy to do that this morning, to endorse that we have a slightly more focused, nuanced approach to this particular council because it stands out as being different from all others in terms of the number of complaints that are being received.
Thank you, Jonathan. Are there any other questions from members? Right, if not, this really was going to be a to-note agenda item, but bearing in mind the points that Jonathan has just made, I would like to propose that we as a committee accept Jonathan's suggestion of creating a new and more robust system for dealing with outlier councils. Do I have a seconder for that proposal? Councillor Pipe, all those in favour? That's carried unanimous. Thank you very much, members. Thank you, Jonathan, for your input. And thank you very much, Neil, for helping us today and taking part and letting us know what it is that DAPTC are planning. I just wonder, perhaps, as a final thought, whether a small conversation between yourself and Jonathan about whether your attendance at a hearing might be useful for yourself to understand our processes, and whether you think that anything could come from that that might help you alter your training, or perhaps think of differing ways of helping town and parish councils. But thank you for your time, sir. Members, if we now move on to agenda item number 9, which is the fraud and whistleblowing update, that is over to our service manager, Mark Eyre. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Chair. So this is the third year of the annual fraud and whistleblowing reporting to this committee. And the report this time covers a number of issues. Firstly, it provides an update on the fraud action plan. This action plan has primarily been driven by issues that have been raised during internal audits, and also the baseline review that SWAP carried out across partners that was referenced earlier on in this meeting. Most of the issues identified within the action plan have either been completed or are now reaching completion. But I just wanted to focus in on a couple of bits in particular. So at present, SWAP are kindly undertaking a process of fraud risk assessment across a range of council services, and the outputs of that work will feed into our overarching risk register process. As with any other risks that we identify, anything identified as high or extreme during that process will be reported through to the appropriate committee. The key outstanding action is to develop the training package for officers and members, and I would look to move this forward on completion of that forward risk assessment work. Hopefully we'll be in a sort of position to provide you a clear update that at future committees. Moving on from the action plan, albeit that it is one of the points of reference within the action plan, onto the policy framework. There are 3 fraud-related policies that were developed prior to the formation of Dorset Council. And we've gone through the process of reviewing those following a number of lessons learnt from incidents that have raised and to reflect any legislation change. So that's the whistleblowing policy, the anti-fraud and corruption policy, and finally the anti-money laundering policy. And there's not any substantial changes. There's some amendments, as I say, that are reflecting on some learnings from cases and some updating of legislation references. But they're presented to you today, hopefully for ratification. And following that, we will look to promote these again, both internally and externally. The final bit of the report is an update on any cases that we've had. So that's in relation to any fraud cases or whistleblowing. There's no fraud that's been reported through to us, but a few whistleblowing cases. One was discontinued as it was managed via an ongoing complaint. One related to management practices, which was partially upheld. And finally, there was a matter that was reported to SWAP and resulted in a couple of bits of internal audit work. I think hopefully I've gone through the main areas covered within that report, and perhaps if I could open it up for any questions, Chair.
Thank you, Mark. Questions, members, any? Councillor Biggs?
So my question's on the anti-fraud, corruption, bribery strategy. And one thing I couldn't quite see in there is a sort of bit about fraud indicators. Because I think a policy should say, or managers should see some guidance as to what may indicate. And people, I know when I was in the civil service, you suddenly start turning up in a very flash car and going on expensive holidays. Of course, there may be a very good reason. You may have inherited a lot of money, but that would perhaps raise eyebrows, and whether that should be in there as part of the training, because people behave differently who tend to commit crime. The other thing I think is also it doesn't look at the drivers for fraud, and it should be particularly concerning now because it's usually there's always people who commit crime wherever they go, but often it's people perhaps on the lower wage area, in debt, financial issues, and temptation is there. They see a system that's perhaps not monitored as well as it should be, and usually go ridiculously over the top and get caught because it's so obvious, but quite often goes on for a long time before it's spotted. So those understanding the causes and drumming in, it's mentioned quite clearly there is zero tolerance, which is absolutely right. Is that ingrained within training? So particularly new junior staff, first thing to say, if you're caught doing this, you will be sacked. There's no two ways about it, unless there's really, extreme mitigating circumstances, mental health or something. And I think I'm sure it is assumed, but it doesn't jump out in the policy, perhaps.
Thanks, Chair. And that's a really good point. And I think you're right, it's not reflected within the policy itself. I mentioned that we are looking to develop some training packages to actually support it, and I'd be inclined to actually incorporate that within the training package.
Any other questions from members? I'm trying to find the page, Mark, but there in the money laundering section, there is a figure, I think, stated as £5,000 and above. Where does that figure come from?
That's a test for me, Chair, because I'm not too sure. That's been carried forward from the existing policy, so I'm not too sure off the top of my head, but I would take that away and look at that, if that's okay.
Perhaps as well I'm being just a little bit too overcautious, but in a public document we've got a £5,000 figure mentioned, so perhaps any crooks or inappropriate people are reading that and then doing potential fraud of below 5,000 because they know it's less likely to be checked. Your thoughts?
That is an interesting observation, Chair. Nothing to really add, though.
Any other questions from members? Okay, the recommendation number 1 is to note the annual update of the fraud and whistleblowing activity, so there's no need for a vote on that. Number 2 is to approve the following updates to the whistleblowing, anti-fraud, corruption and bribery, and the anti-money laundering policy. Do I have a proposer for that? Councillor Pipe, seconder. Councillor Cocking, all those in favour? That's unanimous and carried. Thank you, members. Agenda item 10 is the forward plan. Aidan, you obviously want to add those risks you spoke about earlier to that report. I would also like to see coming forward from yourself and from Mark the issues that I raised earlier about keeping us up to date with the debt levels and also those risks which are over 12 months old. Is there anything else, Aidan or Mark, that you wish to raise at this point? That's a no. Sorry, Mark.
Chair, it's not on the forward plan, but you've passed by the data protection and other mandatory training update, so perhaps just to go back to that shortly.
That's what happens when your computer is playing funny things. Anybody else wishing to make any comments about the forward plan? Okay, that's sorted. Then, Mark, if we go back to the bit that you just mentioned, if you could help and assist me here, because as I say, my computer's... Verbal, right. Over to you, sir.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So this is a verbal update. It follows the request at the last committee meeting where there was concern raised about the perceived low level of completion rates of the data protection mandatory training and mandatory training more generally. So as at last reporting in April, this appeared to be 26% for data protection, which and it was acknowledged that was a very low figure. The committee asked for an update, including any action to be taken to improve compliance. And I'm joined today by Tina from our organisational development team. And between us, we'll hopefully be able to answer any questions that are raised. But just to give a bit of an update on it, the training package that we've got, including the reporting from that, is an externally provided package. And the reporting is previously categorised completion rates into 3 categories. And that's those that have completed the training. And that was what we reported back in April. It's now showing it at 38.77%, but still low in terms of complete. There's an incomplete category, which is by far the largest proportion. That's currently at around 60%. And then there's approximately 3.5% that's noted as overdue. But what I wanted to do was really clarify the confusion over the interpretation of the data, because that category that's identified as incomplete, so the 60%, that includes both those people that have started the module but not completed it, but it also includes those whose training will expire in the next 6 months. So if you take training such as the annual mandatory data protection training, you're talking 50% of the time period is within that 6 months. And actually, most people don't tend to complete the refresher training until when they're nearing the end of that 12-month period. So we've been working with the software provider to try and break down that incomplete data further. And actually, when you do that, it's only about 28.12% is showing as never having completed the training. The remaining 29.63 relates to those whose training will expire in the next 6 months. So I think that actually provides a much more healthy position where approximately 70% have completed the training within the last 12 months. Approximately 30% are either overdue or haven't completed it. And I think what we need to reflect also there is that in terms of those that haven't completed it, some of that will be due to turnover of staff. So we are still doing work to improve training rates. Colleagues in the business intelligence team are currently developing an HR management dashboard that will make easier identification of particular service areas where compliance levels are low, and that will enable us to focus in on those services. But hopefully, I think that I'd like to think that presents a more healthy position than perhaps was presented to the committee last time round. Thank you, Chair.
Any other questions from members? I'll just say, Mark, I appreciate the work that yourself and your team have done to get into these figures a bit more. I still am rather concerned, even now, that we've got in the region of 30% who haven't done or finished the training, which is mandatory training on data protection, which is so important for this organisation. Can you keep this committee regularly informed of that picture, and any thoughts that you may have of how we target that 30% to make sure that that is addressed in a timely fashion? If you're able to update us by our September meeting, I would appreciate that, and I would certainly hope that by then that 30% would be even smaller. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, more than happy to do that. I do think, I mean, there is still some work being done as part of that business intelligence piece of work to fully understand some of that data, and there could be some data within there which is, trying to think how best to explain it, sort of relates to predecessor authority categorisation. So we're doing some work to actually sort of strip out any issues with that data, and hopefully by the time we get to the updated version within that management dashboard, we'll have a clearer picture, and we will enable us to provide that element of focus with services that you've requested.
Councillor Pipe.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mark. The 30%, is that made up of 30? Is it 30% of the council workforce? Is it 30% of councillors, or is it a mixture of both?
Tina, you might want to correct me on this, but did you want to straight away answer it?
Yeah.
Hello, I'm Tina McPollin. I'm the Learning and Development Lead. Yes, it would be a mixture of all of those categories, all of those different areas of the workforce. So that's included in that 28.12%.
Could the councillor element of that, could those names be forwarded to group leaders, chairman, and get this sorted out? Because say, if they don't understand it, then they're not going to know what they're doing.
Couldn't agree with you more, Councillor Pipe. I'm sure we can get something organised as a matter of urgency. The group leaders are aware of any training that councillors haven't done or completed. I'm sure that could be done.
Chair, I just wanted to add as well, I mean, one of the things that we're doing as part of the review of the data protection training is actually coming up with a module that is more specific for councillors as well, which will hopefully be helpful.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mark, and thank you. Members, that is obviously just to note that one. That means we're on to agenda item 12, which is urgent items. I have nothing specific other than I would perhaps ask Aidan whether some training could be provided for our 2 new committee members to bring them up to speed. If that would be done, that would be great. No exempt business today, folks. So at 12:24, meeting closed. Thank you all very much for your help and participation today. Thank you.